Hello and welcome to The Top Story, the podcast with the headlines of the day from our correspondents around the world. I'm Qi Zhi. Coming up in this edition, the Russian delegation has arrived at the residence of the U.S Consulate General in Istanbul, meeting for a second round of talks since Donald Trump returned to office. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer is in Washington to discuss solutions to the Ukraine conflict with President Trump. And Argentinian President Javier Milei is moving fast with his economic program, focusing in large part on reducing inflation and regulation. We begin in Turkey. The Russian delegation has arrived at the residence of the U.S Consulate General in Istanbul. Russian and U.S diplomats are meeting for a second round of talks since Donald Trump returned to office. Discussions aim to ease diplomatic tensions between Moscow and Washington. Jim Spellman has more.
A key topic will be restoring diplomatic staffing levels at the embassies that each country maintains in the other's capital. Improved diplomatic access was one of the goals laid out at the talks in Riyadh.
Our high-level diplomats and experts will meet and consider the systemic problems that have accumulated as a result of the previous U.S. administration's illegal activities to create artificial obstacles for the Russian embassy, to which we naturally reciprocated and also created uncomfortable conditions for the work of the American embassy in Moscow.
The larger goal of the Russian-U.S. talks is to set the table for peace negotiations to end the military conflict between Russia and Ukraine, a key foreign policy goal for U.S. President Donald Trump in his second term.
It's time to end this bloodletting and restore peace, and I think we're going to do it. We've had some great conversations, including with Russia.
Ukraine will not be present for this week's meetings and was not present for the first round of talks in Saudi Arabia. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says a peace deal can't happen without his country having a seat at the table. President Trump says Ukraine will be, quote, part of the talks, but it's unclear how or when the Ukrainians will be brought into the negotiations.
That was Jim Spellman reporting from Washington. In Europe, Ukrainian Prime Minister Denis Shmyhal says his government has approved an agreement with the United States on critical minerals. U.S. President Donald Trump says Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky will visit Washington to sign the deal. Zelensky says the success of the deal will hinge on talks in Washington and continued U.S. aid. Meanwhile, Trump says the U.S. will not be making security guarantees for Ukraine, but Europe will. He also says Ukraine should forget about joining NATO, citing the proposed membership as the reason for the conflict with Russia. Stuart Smith has more from Kyiv.
After serious, publicly aired disagreements, President Zelensky and President Trump look set to agree on this minerals deal, but it's taken on a very different form than was first suggested in the initial drafts. It's now, for a start, being called a Reconstruction Investment Fund, and that gives you a better idea of what this is really about. It's quite limited, and it's acting, Kyiv says, more as a framework than any particular agreement outlining the specifics of the United States and Ukraine's future security relationship. For President Zelensky, he said there were three main things that either had to be removed or added to any draft that he would be able to sign, and he says that all three of those were achieved with this latest version. The first, he said, was there cannot be any reference to the idea that Ukraine is paying back a debt.
The main thing for me is that we're not indebted. Despite what the media says, the agreement does not include $500 billion in debt, $350 billion or $100 billion, because that would be unfair, I think, to us.
The second thing he said is that this deal removes that 100% interest figure that had been in the initial draft. The US hoping to get a 2-for-1 deal, as President Zelensky said, would not be acceptable. And the third thing was there must be at least a reference to security guarantees.
I asked for at least an understanding that we equally see that all this is part of future security guarantees. That's why even in the framework agreement, I really wanted at least a sentence on Ukraine's security guarantees to appear.
President Zelensky says the details will be worked out in a future agreement that would require the ratification of Ukraine's parliament, which will bring back the issues that were discussed about exactly what Washington is ready and willing to provide Ukraine, and also what therefore Washington would demand in return. So a progress of sorts in the US-Ukraine relationship, a deal to be signed and a meeting, importantly, taking place likely on Friday between President Zelensky and President Trump. But the difficulties and issues surrounding the initial discussion of a minerals for security agreement have not been resolved. Those have merely seemingly been pushed down the road.
Dr. Stuart Smith on the possible terms of the minerals deal between Kyiv and Washington. In North America, British Prime Minister Keir Starmer is in Washington to discuss solutions to the Ukraine conflict with U.S. President Donald Trump. Starmer is asking the U.S. for security guarantees for Ukraine. He says the only way to maintain long-term peace is for Washington to back any possible deployment of European peacekeepers in Ukraine. Starmer will also host European leaders in London this weekend. Reports say Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky may join the gathering. Benji Haya has more on Starmer's trip to Washington.
Well, this follows a visit by another of his European counterparts, French President Emmanuel Macron, as both of them really try to present the vision to the United States, to Donald Trump in particular, that yes, Europe will step up and bolster its own defences, but also there needs to be a guarantee of a US backstop in order to provide some sort of deterrent to President Vladimir Putin. There is, of course, Article 5 of the NATO Pact, which suggests that an attack on one state is an attack on all, but there is scepticism on the European continent as to whether Donald Trump would fulfil that obligation. What I think Sir Keir Starmer needs to do from a UK perspective is explain to his American counterpart that this war or an agreement to finish the war is still important and significant for the United States, but that rushing into a weaker deal could potentially backfire. Now, on Sir Keir Starmer's side is the fact that he's going to be coming to Washington right off the back of an announcement he made in Britain to increase its defence funding at the expense of foreign aid. That'll be good for Donald Trump to hear, placate the US president perhaps, but it doesn't always meaning that there's a turn from the UK towards the US. This is also about an acknowledgement that the UK needs to step up its own defences. What the British government has been trying to say over the past couple of days is that this does not have to be a historic choice between choosing the United States, a partner in its special relationship, or its close neighbours in Europe. But ultimately there is this growing rift now across the Atlantic of which Prime Minister Starmer will try and bridge, and we've seen that most apparently given the votes in the United Nations, with the US siding not with the UK, not with its European allies and partners, but instead with the likes of Russia.
That was Benji Haya reporting. Prime Minister Starmer earlier said he would accelerate a plan for the UK to increase defence spending to 2.5% of GDP by 2027. This comes amid President Trump's demand that Europe should take responsibility for its own security. Michael Voss reports.
Defence spending is now the new priority, but where will the money come from? And what sort of painful decisions will European governments have to make between boosting defence and maintaining social welfare? In order to defend Ukraine and deter further threats to its sovereignty, a new study says Europe would need an additional 300,000 troops. And it's not just extra boots on the ground, but new military hardware that will be required. All this would cost more than $260 billion extra a year. Next week, the European Union will hold an emergency summit on how to strengthen the bloc's defence.
That was Michael Voss on the security dilemma in Europe. In South America, Argentinian President Javier Milei is moving fast with his economic program, focusing in large part on reducing inflation and regulation. In contrast to the new economic policy in the United States, his government is removing tariffs on electric vehicle imports. Jill Richards spoke with car owners and a former government official in Buenos Aires to find out more.
For years, Argentine consumers have faced the highest prices in Latin America when it comes to buying a new car.
In Argentina, the price of a car is nearly 90% above its actual value because of taxes. This makes it very expensive to buy a car, and the situation is even worse for hybrids.
But major changes to the sector are coming.
Argentina has removed import tariffs on electric and hybrid vehicles. It's also reducing taxes on more expensive cars and vehicles. The government's aim is to push down prices for consumers.
Up to 50,000 vehicles will be allowed to enter the country this year under the new policy. Argentina still lacks infrastructure for wide use of electric cars, but there is high demand for hybrid models. And prices are already going down by between 10 and 40%, according to former production minister Dan Tesica.
This sector was highly regulated. There were problems importing and difficulties accessing dollars. As a result, there were very few vehicles available, there was little supply, and there were many restrictions. Without inflation, inefficiencies disappear and there will be more competition. We're going to go through a significant process of creative destruction.
Removing import tariffs on electric vehicles is one of the latest economic measures taken by the libertarian President Javier Milei. His deregulation programme has earned international attention. Last week, Milei gifted Elon Musk a chainsaw during an event outside Washington, the tool symbolising the solidarity Milei feels with the special advisor to US President Trump, as the tech billionaire orchestrates drastic cuts to America's federal government. Under Milei's radical economic programme, public spending has been slashed, and Argentina's chronic high inflation is slowing. Monthly price increases were down to just over 2% in January, down from 25% during Milei's first month as president. Argentina's economic landscape is shifting, but Milei faces challenges. The president's image has been hit by what's been dubbed Cryptogate. Milei denies promoting the failed cryptocurrency Libra, despite posting a link to it on social media. Yet his economic programme continues. In private, car dealers say they expect car sales to increase by up to 25% this year, boosted by the removal of tariffs and reduction of taxes.
That was Joe Richards on Argentina's latest foreign trade measures. Finally, in China, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi has called on New Zealand to help guide their comprehensive strategic partnership on the right path. He made the call while meeting New Zealand Foreign Minister Winston Peters in Beijing. The two diplomats acknowledged strong bilateral ties and stressed the importance of dialogue on regional and global issues. Zhao Yunfei has details.
A dialogue to pursue common development and strengthen ties. Wang, also a member of the Political Bureau of the Communist Party of China Central Committee, said China's relationship with New Zealand has long been at the forefront of those between China and Western countries.
The development of China-New Zealand relations has contributed to the stable growth of New Zealand's economy and has also integrated into China's development process. I appreciate your efforts in this regard.
He added the two sides have maintained a healthy development momentum. Peters, also New Zealand's Deputy Prime Minister, said the talks between the two leaders have come at a critical time.
We are meeting at a time of great uncertainty and strain, with the conflict in Ukraine having just entered its fourth year and the Middle East turning to rebuild and addressing the immense humanitarian need on the ground. Our dialogue with China on bilateral, regional and international issues is more important than ever.
This is the first official visit by Foreign Minister Winston Peters to China since he took office in 2023. China says it hopes to set up strategic communication, enhance mutual understanding, and boost exchange with New Zealand. This year marks the beginning of the second decade for the comprehensive strategic partnership between China and New Zealand. China says the meeting provides strategic guidance for the two countries to continue their sound and steady growth.
That was Zhao Yunfei reporting. Now recapping the headlines before we go, the Russian delegation has arrived at the residence of the U.S. Consulate General in Istanbul, meeting with U.S. diplomats for a second round of talks since Donald Trump returned to office. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer is in Washington to discuss solutions to the Ukraine conflict with U.S. President Donald Trump. And Argentinian President Javier Milei is moving fast with his economic program, focusing in large part on reducing inflation and regulation. And that's it for this edition of The Top Story, a podcast that brings you world headlines every weekday. For more news in politics, business, sports and culture, you can subscribe to the Beijing Hour, a one-hour podcast news magazine program. We would welcome and appreciate all ratings and reviews. I'm Qi Zhi. Thank you for listening.